Hello again and welcome back to our Black Mirror review series. Today we take a look at Black Mirror's holiday special, White Christmas. First off, just the idea of a Black Mirror Christmas special is kind of ridiculous. Because, well, it's Black Mirror, one of the most cynical and depressing shows ever, and holiday specials are usually meant to be comfy and safe and, you know, watched by the fire with your family type deals. So going into it, I thought Charlie Brooker was just gonna steal Christmas from us, but that's not what happens here. The episode doesn't really dissect the holiday like I thought it would. Christmas is just used as the setting in which the story happens to take place in. The plot itself has very little to do with Christmas as a concept, but having it as the setting gives it a really nice cold atmosphere, which I really liked. Anyways, the way this episode is structured is pretty different to episodes prior. The first two seasons of Black Mirror both had 3 45-minute episodes each. What they do in White Christmas is package 3 smaller interconnected stories into one big hour-and-a-half movie, basically. The first 2 stories are told to us via Jon Hamm's character Matthew in order to befriend Potter, who we'll talk about later. Our first story is about Matt's side job, which is him acting as a sort of invisible wingman to socially awkward dudes who are in search of a girlfriend or just trying to get laid. Here's how it works. Everyone in the episode has these things called Seta eyes, which allow you to take pictures, block people, and most relevant to this story, stream what you're seeing to others. Basically, Matt and his team, I guess, helped this kid called Harry crashing off his Christmas party to try and get him a date. One thing leads to another, and Harry ends up getting invited back to Jennifer's apartment. All is good and well until we find out that Jennifer is actually suicidal and schizophrenic. And to make matters worse, she thinks Harry is too after she overhears him talking to the voices in his head, which in reality was him talking to Matt and the rest of the group. Long story short, Jennifer murders Harry with a poisoned drink and then kills herself.
Well, it's not much of a Christmas story.
Okay, first off, are dating coaches even a real thing? Well, to be honest, I'm not really sure. While researching, the closest thing I could find was sites that give you dating tips, but not a full-on dating coach like we see in the episode. But honestly, I'd be surprised if they weren't a real thing. Anyways, morally speaking, I think this whole coaching deal is pretty messed up, mainly because of 2 reasons. First, you're pretty much manipulating these women into sleeping with you. Like hell, they even categorize them with labels such as,
I'd say she's a level 4 rock chick.
like, good God. Second, and most damning of all, is the fact that all these people watch each other have sex. Like, without the chick's consent, which is illegal. Very illegal. Like, I'm pretty sure it'd fall under revenge porn law or something along those lines. Now, let's talk about one of my favorite things from this episode, the character of Matt. As I said before, Matt is played by Jon Hamm, who, as you can probably tell just by looking at him, is one of the most charismatic actors working today. Like, he's the type of person who could get you to tell him your deepest, darkest secrets in the blink of an eye, because he just seems so swell and charismatic and cool and like, just look at the guy, look at him. He gives off such an aura of trust and friendliness. Like, one of the best things about this episode is that the episode knows this and plays around with it. It plays with the audience's expectations of who Matt is as a character. At first, we see him as a kind-hearted man who just wants to have a conversation with a fellow coworker. But as the episode goes on, we get to see more of his dark side. An example of this would be the fact that he is not a reliable narrator, meaning that what he tells Potter is not 100% the truth. While his story is based on reality, he sneaks in a few lies to make himself look less guilty. Our second story revolves around Greta, who has just undergone a surgery to literally make a clone of her consciousness and then have it put into this thing called a cookie. A cookie being similar to those Amazon Alexa things. To put it simply, it controls your house and acts as your personal secretary. To get her clone to do this, however, Matt has to put it frankly, torture it into submission by placing her into solitary confinement until she agrees to do what she's told.
How are we feeling now?
Please, give me something to do.
Now, morally speaking, I'm kind of divided on whether or not this cookie thing would be immoral because, well, they're not real people. It's just code. But on the other hand, it thinks it's a real person and it acts like a real person, so that complicates things a bit. I mean, the way I look at it would be like watching a really gory, torture-pornish movie like Saw, for example. Now, me personally, I see these types of movies as being kind of disgusting and fucked up, but I wouldn't call them immoral because the violence they show is not actually real. The actors who were tortured in these movies weren't actually tortured, it's all fake. Which I think is the same deal with the text shown in the episode. It's not a real person, it just acts like a real person. It pretends to be a real person, but in reality, it's not. It's nothing more than code. Also, if I said that the cookie was immoral, that would mean that I'd also have to condemn things like violent video games as well, because it's pretty much the same thing. In both cases, you're torturing, or in the case of most games, killing virtual representations of life, and I don't see that as being immoral because, as I said before, it's just code. However, I could potentially see it as being immoral if the customers who are paying for the cookie didn't fully understand what was inside of it. I think the episode might be hinting to that being the case because of the following reasons. Firstly, Greta's clone doesn't know that she was cloned, and to my understanding, the clones are supposed to be a literal copy of their host, memories included. So wouldn't she remember when Matt explained her how everything worked? Secondly, the fact that when the Greta clone speaks with the real Greta, she doesn't use her actual voice like she did with Matt, but instead uses a generic computer voice.
11 a.m. Hair with Stelios. 12:30. Lunch at Barney's Brasserie with Annabelle.
I'm not doing this. I'm not some sort of push-button toaster monkey.
Would you prefer to do nothing?
Well, I'm not doing this.
So basically the way I think it works is that they explain the cookie in the vaguest way possible so that potential customers aren't freaked out by the fact that they're kind of enslaving themselves to themselves. Our third and last story revolves around Joe Potter and how he ended up in the cabin with Matt. His story begins when he finds a pregnancy test in the trash can, which implies that his wife, Beth, is pregnant. Overjoyed by this, Joe goes and asks Beth about it. She confirms that she is in fact pregnant, but she'll be having an abortion because she just doesn't want it. Naturally, Joe and Beth have a huge argument over this, which ends with Beth blocking Joe and then leaving the next morning. Blocking in this world works the same way you'd block someone in Facebook or Twitter, the only difference being that it's in real life instead of just in the computer. Now, this brings up another pretty interesting question, it being, why do we block people? Well, I think it's fair to say that people react in a more hostile manner when what you're telling them is kind of true. As an example, if someone told me, dude, you're a faggot, I'm not gonna get super mad because it's not remotely true. But if someone told me, dude, your voice sounds gay as fuck, I might get a little bit upset because, like, I don't have the manliest voice in the world, and basically, what I'm trying to say here is that I'd be more inclined to block the person whose insult had some semblance of truth in it rather than the one that didn't. So, in the case of the episode, I think she blocked him because she couldn't handle the truth. Deep down, she knew that he was right, and she hated that. A few months later, Joe spots Beth in town and notices that she didn't abort the baby. He goes and tries to talk to her, but because of the block, he's unable to. He ends up getting arrested and is given a restraining order as well, which bans Joe from going near both Beth and the baby. Determined to see her anyways, Joe embarks on a pilgrimage every Christmas to Beth's father's cottage in order to at least see his daughter's silhouette. This goes on for a period of 5 years until Beth dies, which in turn lifts the block on Joe's daughter. Joe then heads back to the cottage and is finally able to see his daughter. However, he finds out that he was not the father all along. Beth had cheated on him with another man. Joe then goes inside the cottage and confronts Beth's dad, and during the confrontation, loses his temper and hits him in the head with a snow globe, which kills him. Joe proceeds to flee the scene, leaving Beth's daughter alone in the cottage. She then heads out to try and find help, but ends up freezing to death instead. If I had to describe this story in one sentence, it'd be a completely avoidable tragedy. This whole thing could have been easily avoided if Beth just told Joe the truth. If instead of running from her problems and acting acting like the victim, she faced them instead, like, you know, an adult. Like, let's put this into perspective. This is a woman who would rather mentally torture this poor guy into believing that he had a child for 5 years, rather than admit that she was in the wrong. She'd rather maintain the quote-unquote moral high ground than admit that she made a mistake. Unlike in the entire history of You, I can actually put the blame on someone here, it being Beth. Anyways, after Joe finishes telling his story, we find out that Matt wasn't just a conversation-hungry coworker. In reality, they were both inside a cookie, and Matt was just there to get a confession out of Joe's clone in order to get released early for the crimes he committed in the second story. Oh, and I should probably point out that this confession would by no means hold up in an actual real-world court. In actual courts, full-blown confessions can be declared inadmissible for the smallest of details. One of which includes being under the influence, and yeah, Potter has had his good share of drinks during his confession. Then there's also the obvious fact that the confession is being given by a machine and not by the real Potter, which makes little to no sense. Like, this is a world in which clones of people are seen as being just code. They don't have any rights, but they're fully able to give a confession under the law? That's a bit contradictory in my book. However, I should clarify that I don't see this as being a flaw or a plot hole by any means. I'm just pointing out how crooked, distorted, and, to put it frankly, fucked up this episode's judicial and moral system seems to be. This episode presents a judicial system which completely ignores all the shades of gray that usually come with crimes. As an example, let's look at the police's treatment of Joe. Like, none of the cops are even remotely empathetic to him. They see him as a monster. They see him the same way people saw Victoria in White Bear. Like, at least in White Bear, I can understand why you'd be outraged by the crime. But here? Well, yes, what he did was undeniably horrible. I think most people can at least empathize with the guy. Anyways, Matt is then released from custody under one condition. He is to be blocked.
By who?
By everyone.
This ending. Good God. Like, what can you even say about it? It's depressing, it's disturbing, it's tragic, but most of all, it's cruel. Like, all throughout the episode, we've seen the horrors of being blocked by just one or two people, and now it's everyone. This punishment is especially cruel because Ham's character has been established as a people's person, someone who loves to socialize and talk to people, so this punishment must be like a personal hell for him. Anyways, when it comes to what this ending is commentating on, I think it's criticizing the fact that governments put all sexual offenders on the same level regardless of what their crime was. For example, if you take a piss in a bush, you could be placed in the same list as exhibitionists, pedophiles, and even rapists. People whose crimes are a lot more severe than just taking a piss in a bush. A common complaint I hear for this episode is that the stories don't flow that well together. And yeah, they kind of don't. Like, you can obviously tell that each individual story here was probably at some point supposed to be their own standalone episode. So considering that, I think the creators did a pretty good job in making the stories not feel completely unrelated to each other. The first two stories serve more as introductions to the technology that we'll eventually see in the main event. If the episode dropped the first two stories and relegated itself to a 45-minute runtime, it'd have to waste a lot of precious time introducing each technology. Like, one must keep in mind that White Christmas has a grand total of 3 different technologies, whereas previous episodes usually only had 1. Having these extra stories in the beginning serves as a great way to introduce each technology without it feeling too forced or crowded. Anyways, in conclusion, I absolutely loved this episode. It felt like a great return to glory after 2 good but not great episodes. So yeah, that's that. Thanks for watching.